Greetings and thanks for tuning in. This is the second webinar of PLP Pathways for our 2018-2019 school year. Today we're going to be focusing on goals, evidence, and thinking about integrated literacy, so how literacy can help support the conversations that we have with students about goal setting. We are joined today by an expert in the field, Christine Hertz, who's the author of Kid First from Day One and Mindset for Learning. So Christine, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, definitely. Great to be here. I am an author, but also a teacher and a literacy specialist and instructional coach in Worcester, Vermont. So just north of Montpelier. It's fun to be participating in a Vermont webinar, and I'm happy to be here.
And we're also joined by our panel. So Kevin, do you want to start by introducing yourself?
Good. Hi, I'm Kevin Hunt. I'm a 5'8" generalist at Wilson Central School.
Hi, I'm Meg O'Donnell. I'm a 5'8". Oh, no, I'm not. I'm a 6'8" generalist at Shelburne Community School on the Alpha team.
Hi, I'm Don Taylor. I'm a language arts and social studies teacher for grades 7 and 8 on team dynamics at Main Street Middle School in Montpelier.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Hallman, and I am a program director for Up for Learning, which is a nonprofit.
And I'm Maura Wheeler. I'm the proficiency-based learning and technology integration coach at Lamoille South Supervisory Union and former middle level teacher. So our focus for today on goals, after this webinar, we'll be sending out a Google form that you can take to earn PD hours. And the code word, the word of the webinar is growth-based goals, which is what we'll really be focusing on today. So to start our conversation, I wanted to start with an excerpt from one of Christine's books, A Mindset for Learning. And in their text, they say, goals can have a powerful impact on how we live our lives. They require us to engage the entire constellation of stances: empathy, flexibility, persistence, resiliency, and optimism, as we set and work towards a specific outcome. Yet perhaps, most importantly, they provide our students with an opportunity to develop their own agency and identity in our classrooms. So with that, I have some questions for Christine to help us sort of understand the theory behind why we set goals with students. So Christine, what does research tell us about the importance of setting goals? And why is this particularly important with young adolescents?
I think that one thing that we're learning more and more is that the more aware we are of our own thinking and our metacognition and our expectations about our learning and our growth, the more we are actually learning and growing. There have been a lot of studies about how just by talking about the brain and how the brain is a muscle, and if you give it a hard workout, it grows more, you actually learn more in the classes. And one way that we can do this for our students is to help them set goals that really or drive at something that they're interested in learning, that they want to get better at, that they have a curiosity about, that is motivating to them. And I think that when you're working with young adolescents and all children, but specifically young adolescents, there's a lot of power in tapping into that agency and that identity as a learner. We talk a lot in younger grades about children, their play personalities, and thinking about if somebody's really motivated by something like being a competitor or being an artist or being a storyteller. And Stuart Brown has all these play personalities. And I think with older students and young adolescents, we can tap into those same kind of internal intrinsic drives where we're thinking about what kind of goals you want to set and how is it going to bring your self of identity as a learner and as a person and your interest in the world right into the classroom and into your learning.
Great, thanks. So one of the things about goal setting is that we know is that it can be a really engaging opportunity for students. One of the things that I know that you talk about is this idea of true motivation. So can you talk to us a little bit about motivation and how motivation is related to goal setting?
Definitely. So there are lots of different kinds of motivation, and the primary one that we're born with is this biological motivation. So that's when, you know, you're thirsty, you drink something, you're hungry, you eat something. And so researchers at first thought this was like the sole motivation was biological. Next, then you layer on something like an extrinsic motivation, like punishments and rewards. And for a long time, and still today, the school system in particular has kind of moved towards this punishment reward system, treating grades as a reward, or loss of recess as a punishment, and thinking that this is what would motivate students. And the more research that's being done and the more we know about true intrinsic motivation, the more we realize that it's not really about carrots and sticks or rewards and punishment. It's about tapping into engagement. And Daniel Pink, who wrote the book Drive, which I would really highly recommend, found that there are three primary factors for motivation. And the first factor is having a sense that you're working towards mastery. It's not that you need to be working towards perfection and this idea that you will attain nirvana, but rather that you're getting better at something. I'm sure we've all had the experience where we have been working on something, but not feeling like you're really improving. And that sense of stagnancy is not super motivating. So for students, we think about, okay, can they see what's expected? Can they see their own self-efficacy? Can they see how to move along a progression? And then, so do they feel like they're moving towards a sense of mastery or growth? And then the second aspect is a sense of autonomy. And so that's when we come back to this idea of choice and this idea of having some kind of direction. And this is where goal setting really starts to tie in, because once you give somebody a little bit of autonomy, then all of a sudden the motivation does become more and more internal. And that autonomy could be something like thinking about goal setting, but it could also be the literature or the books or the articles that you're pulling into your classroom. Instead of just saying, this is what we're all doing, it's here are the choices. What are you interested in? What's kind of speaking to you? And then the third factor is, so it's mastery, autonomy, and then purpose. And the third factor is that we have found, I say we, like I've done the research, researchers have found, and I have found in my work with kids and in classrooms, that if we're working towards a purpose, then we will, we'll work harder and we'll be more engaged in it. And so this idea of the fact that you don't want to just be working for a product, but rather for a deeper sense of purpose. And so if you're writing for a specific audience member. If you're conducting a science experiment, it's to solve a problem that you're really interested in. So these are three big factors: mastery, autonomy, and purpose. And the goal setting ties in because we want our goals that we're co-constructing with students to really align to these three factors, so that it's not a pulling them along a continuum, but rather that they feel like they're making progress and are motivated just for themselves.
Great, thanks. And can you talk a little bit more about when we do set goals with kids, is this something that's like a standalone? Like, do you stop everything, you say, okay, now we're going to talk about setting goals? Or is it something that's sort of integrated into the content areas? And then sort of as you're also thinking about that, you talk about this idea of just right goals. So what does that mean? Like, what is a just right goal, and how do you talk about that with kids?
Sure. So we co-opted the language just right goals from a phrase that teachers have been using with for years, which would be a just right book. So we talk about reading a book that's a good level of challenge, not too hard, not too easy, something super engaging. It's just right because it's exciting to you, and something, again, you're motivated by. And a goal is the same type of thing. It's not that you're trying to, John Hattie has done a lot of work around goal setting, and he says that you don't want to bridge chasms, you want to bridge small gaps. And so a just right goal means that you're helping the child see what's just beyond their ability to do on their own, and in the next step, their zone of proximal development. And so when you're starting to notice a child kind of like, or a student, I shouldn't call them all children when they're young adolescents. When you're noticing a student starting to like dip their toe into a certain writing technique, or be interested in noticing symbols as they're reading, those are opportunities to really kind of say, like, this is something that you can do that's just beyond what you can do on your own. This is a bridgeable gap. And the way that I have been goal setting with students is to do it as like my conferences. And so for years, I would do conferences that were more teaching conferences, where I would say, oh, today I want to teach you, and then add a little bit more to whatever we were on about as a class. And the shift to make the conferences goal setting was really powerful, because all of a sudden the students had so much more agency in what they were doing. And I was able to kind of take back the content specific goal off a little bit. It was no longer just about, reading about a certain genre, and really apply more of the cognitive task, or thinking about like deep thinking and reading and things like that. And so that's where I tucked in those just right goals with students. It is a process of reflection. And so just like in any type of learning, and we do this as adults too, you might set a goal that is too big or not obtainable. And that is certainly a part of the process. And then that part of reflection with the teacher is where you learn, like, sometimes goals don't work out, and you reset them and you change them up.
Great, and thanks. And just for when you talk about conferencing with kids, you mean like in the classroom, having those one-on-one conferring conversations with kids to help them sort of.
Yeah, exactly. So I've done most of my work in a workshop model, and so all the other students would be working independently, and this is not a formal kind of conference, but it's just like a quick conference, trying to meet with each child at least once a week, touch base on goals, set goals, and keep the cycle going.
Great, thanks. So I know in schools we're constantly talking about growth mindset, but when we think about developing goals, there's all different formats that people use to set goals. How can we use Carol Dweck's research on growth mindset to help us develop goals and co-construct them with our students?
Yeah, so this was a huge aha for me. Originally, when I was helping students set goals, I would be thinking about much more of a product-based goal, like I'll write a personal narrative in the course of a week, or I'll understand this specific math concept. And now I think that her work is all about thinking about the process over the product. And so going back to the idea of you don't want your goals to be strictly academic. You want them to be cognitive as well. So I'm not going to have a student set a goal like, I'm going to memorize all 50 state capitals. I'm going to have them think about if they're really interested in investigating geography, and we have the time and the lens, and then we're working on that, then what's the meaty goal that's behind that? So she talks about telling the story of the goal. So first of all, it's process-based. And so it's not that in the end you will come up with this product. So if I'm thinking of an example from my own life, then I'm not going to have such a large goal like I will run a marathon, because that's a very product-based goal. But instead, I'm going to have a process goal that might help me get to a product that I'm excited and proud about. But my process goal is going to be like my physical therapist whispering in my ear, like, short strides, land on your, short strides, lands on the middle of your feet. You can, I can tell you all about his tips in a little bit. But the side is that that's a very like specific goal. And the story that Carol Dweck says to tell about a goal is the what, the how, and the when and the where of the goal. So what you should do, how you should do it, and when and where you should be doing it. So if we're writing these meaty goals, it's not run a marathon. It's when I land on my, in my stride, then I will land in the middle of my foot, instead of my heel, and then be able to really propel myself forward. And so taking a more academic specific or school specific example, if you're thinking about helping a child or a student think about theme in reading literature, then instead of just saying like, I'll analyze theme, maybe you would say something, have them develop a goal like, when I'm noticing repeating symbols and patterns in a novel, I will jot them in my notebook and connect them to previous themes to answer the question, what's this really about? What is this saying about the book and the world? So meteor goals tell a story. And there are different ways that you can help students create these meteor goals, but essentially, you want to make sure that they're based on not an end product, but the process, and that they leave you with like a little bit of an instruction manual of what to do and how to, work towards the goal.
It reminds me so much of the transferable skills, which is what we anchor our goals on. And so kind of like using that story and the transferable skills really are that process that really helps to sort of reframe some of those pieces.
Definitely.
So we have time for one last quick question for you, Christine. And that's about, so now that a student has a goal, so they've come up with the story of their goal, are there any strategies to help a student remember the goal?
Yeah. And so Vygotsky has this name for something that you need to take from one place to the next to kind of help you remember something. It's called a mediator. And you need something to go from one place to the next, because we all know as adults how easy it is to set a goal. I mean, talk to any of us in January. You set a goal and then all of a sudden it's disappeared. So there are different ways that you can do this. And basically, I try to build in a process for regular reflection. And so if you have a reading goal, then at the end of every reading or throughout the course of a reading workshop block, you're checking in with yourself about your goal. Putting it on a sticky note, writing it in a notebook, keeping it, if you have a goal that is about writing and you're doing your writing on a Chromebook, then having some kind of like quick little Google Doc or like a link that you can, or you could even create a form for your students where they're like submitting quick little pieces of evidence about how they're meeting their goal, not in like an accountability way, except for themselves, that they're saying, oh, okay, I'm going to check in with the goal and this part is working, this part is not working. Even a tiny little like, I know that there's some writers who write like one sentence and they put it on the top of their computer, like, I'm blanking on her name, but I think it was Anne Lamott wrote bird by bird and then wrote it on top of their computer. And so just even a catchphrase that then is linked to the meteor piece of the goal that you can come back to. Anything that will help students carry that forward.
Great, thanks. That's some really great tips. So I think we're gonna turn it over and sort of hear from the panel and talk about what it looks like in their classrooms based on a lot of this work, because I know there's a lot of connections to some of the things that you were just talking about.
Great, so I think that's my cue. So panel, maybe we could start with just the basic, how do you engage students in goal setting in your own classrooms or your own learning environments?
Well, I can talk to that a little bit. One of the things one of the reasons I asked Christine about whether or not it's sort of a standalone is that I actually spend almost like a week talking to kids about goals. And I ask them to, what is their definition of a goal and what makes a good goal and what makes a not good goal. And then we list all those characteristics. And then we talk about growth mindset and we talk a little bit about grit. And then I also show them this guy, Walter Mischel, who's the guy who did the marshmallow experiment and talks about self-discipline. And so we use those three pillars or those three foundations of growth mindset, grit, and self-discipline and talk about goals. And what I found is that if you invest a lot of time talking about goals, that the kids understand it, and then you don't have to go back to it as much as you would if you were just trying to integrate it in spots. But one of the most interesting things, I really liked how Christina was talking about this idea of making the goals visible, I guess, is sort of, the kids have told me repeatedly that they don't go back to their goals enough. And they don't see them enough and they're not reminded of them enough. So that's something that is really hitting home, I guess, is how do I structure exercises where kids are going back to their goals on a frequent basis and deciding whether or not metacognitively those goals are good goals, like bridging a short gap, or if they're, not constructed correctly. So anyway, that's how we do it in our classroom. And it's really interesting to hear some of the different viewpoints on that I can integrate into our practice.
Yeah. Before the rest of the panel speaks to that, I was also just thinking, Don, one way to have them continuously go back to their goals, as Christine was saying, like for that reminder, and then to connect to maybe a question that we'll get to in a moment around families is, I know in my classroom we did a weekly memo home. So the learners that I worked with would send an email to their advisor, myself, and their caregiver, parent, guardian, caregiver about their week. But it wasn't just generic in the sense that it was just about their week, although they did talk about highlights and areas that they want to work on. But they looked at their goals each week and talked about the small steps to getting to their goals. So that might be just a one strategy for having kids thinking about their goals, that they are really important and they're important to their families too. And that there's all these supports in place to help them get towards their goals, but that we're holding them accountable.
And I just want to add to that I've totally stolen your idea about those emails home, and the parents really enjoy it. But I was just thinking as you're talking that could be a place where you're telling the story behind the goal as well. Through that email, and that you could be telling the story or the process to your family, because that would meet that authentic audience piece as well, which could help with the motivation. So again, just thinking about, for me, I'm sitting here thinking about that construct, like, oh, maybe I can add that to the graphic organizer that we use for the email and have kids start telling the story of their goals to an authentic audience. But yeah, I like that. Thank you very much.
Yeah. How about Meg or Kevin? How about how do you gauge students in your classrooms in goal setting?
I can talk just about a really sort of concrete way that we've been helping kids, especially when we have new incoming sixth graders. We set the bulk of our conference of our goals after the first part of the year. So we give kids a little bit of time to get acclimated to their grade and what their expectations are. One thing we start the year off always is just with like a simple independent reading goal and having them track, do you want to track minutes? Do you want to track number of pages? And they build a graph. And it's not so much about the independent reading. It's really about kids get motivated, I think, when they see, oh, wow, when I start to collect data on something, I start to realize some patterns about who I am as a learner. And I notice some things about how I spend my time and what happens on Monday. I never seem to read enough on Mondays. And when we are able to look at our patterns of learning, we can then start to see, I can probably set a goal around this idea because I have this really concrete data to look at. And from there, we'll have kids then set a reading goal with some action steps. And that process of doing it that way is going to set them up. They're going to start to log their progress and work through either an online tool called Biblionasium, or they're going to then move that into their PLPs for Protean. And I think that'll set them up for when they start to do a bigger goal related to the transferable skills. So that's just one way of helping them see their own agency in the process.
Thank you. How about you, Kevin?
Yeah, so I mean, we, being a multi-age team, we catch our kids in 5th grade with our Hopes and Dreams conferences.
Last call for letting the office know if you're going.
That's fine. That's so when looking back at Don's question about do we explicitly teach about goal setting, for us that's kind of when we have that goal setting conversation, when they're learning what setting goals looks like. So in the summer we send home that profile form, and they talk about their hobbies and interests on one page, and the other page we're looking at the 5 transferable skills, and that's the areas in which they set their goals. And we have those conversations, and that happens before school starts. And then for our returning students, our 6th or 8th graders, we catch them in September and early October for their goal setting conferences, and we'll look through goals that they've had and review them and see if they want to keep them. One thing that helps us with getting kids to remember their goals and having them sink in is that weekly reflection. So on their site, let's see, if we have a tab, and each week the students, we have 30 minutes of PLP time. The students will come in, and part of their requirements for that time is they just look at their 5 goals and they just write down a quick blurb for each goal about how they're either working on that goal this week, or how they're thinking about the goal, or if they're not working on it or haven't done anything for it, think about their next steps, or think about why they haven't really thought about the goal. And then we always have them add each week a new piece of evidence on one of their goal pages for anything that they've done. And one thing I've noticed is when we're having our goal setting conferences and meeting with these kids, thing that's really, really helpful is when they're coming up with these goals. And again, they're based on transferable skills. So it might be a goal like I can demonstrate understanding of my learning by showing my work in multiple pathways. And that's more of a transferable, executive functioning type skill goal that they'll have. One thing that helps me is while they're setting that goal and we're talking about it as their PLP committee, is I'll ask them, okay, what would that look like for evidence? What type of things are you thinking about right now that you can show on your PLP site? And for me, that's when it really starts to sink into them, because if they might come up with a great goal and I'm like, all right, great, what's that going to look like for evidence? And they're like, I have no idea. And that's usually a red flag to have, a follow-up conversation to make sense. So that's a piece that we do pretty regularly that helps us on Swift House.
Great. How about just to go back to that family piece about, and I know we've spoken about this before, maybe even last time as well, about the involvement of families in goal setting process and how they can become an integral part of that in many ways. Would anybody like to start us off with that? And please, Christine, feel free to chime in too.
Well, one thing that we do about the families is that we set goals. I am a calendar type person. So and Christine talked about identity of learners. And I think that's so important, because we spend probably the first 4 to 6 weeks learning about our kids and what's motivating them. And then we have them set goals. So I spend a lot of time thinking about the kids' strengths and challenges and observing the kids and through all sorts of different activities. And then we have them set these goals, and I have them set the goals about a month ahead of the conferences, so that, as Kevin mentioned, we can have them be collecting evidence, but then we can also have the families look at the goals that the kids have set and have their input. This year, I also tried to have the kids set some primary goals and have the parents reflect on that. And I found that the response rate was really uneven. And so that's something that's concerning to me, is that you have kids who are really well supported and are communicating with their families. And for them, it's no problem. Oh yeah, here's my parent looked at my goal and gave me input. But for a lot of kids, that doesn't happen. And so for those, how are we how are we creating equity for all families and all kids and communicating out to all families? And that's something that is definitely a big challenge right now.
Would anybody else like to talk about the family involvement engagement piece?
I think ours just goes back to that that Friday email. We have kids, you know, we sort of have these Friday takeaways and have an ongoing doc where we share that with kids to prompt them about, here's some things you can talk about in your Friday email. And that just helps get the conversation going with parents about, hey, this is what's happening for me at school this week. Here's the 3, 2, 1, or the rose, the bud, the thorn, whatever that reflective kind of idea is. So when we go to sit down to have the conversation, our parent conferences are our student-led portfolio conferences are happening in November. And so that will be the time when the kids and the parents, and we'll just sit down and look. And a lot of times we'll ask kids to share the work with their parents up front before we sit down at the conference. So it gives them, gives parents some private reasoning time, or whoever the adult is. You know, Don, I'm mindful of more and more kids that are where it's difficult to have that one parent or guardian who's available. So sometimes we'll ask our special educator or the paraeducator on our team or one of our EA teachers who's willing to be that adult to look through their work and then come. So when they come to the conference, they feel a little bit more informed about what their child's doing. It doesn't feel like this is the first time that they're seeing that work or having these conversations about their work. I think that front loading helps ease some of the discussion at the conference.
Can I jump in for 1 second?
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that the more we're talking about goals, the more I'm thinking about myself in the shoes of the students and what a vulnerable position this is to be in, to be setting goals, and especially as a new student on a team. And I think that looping the families in to make it feel like more of a cohesive process, like you're growing as a person, not just in this isolation in this new classroom, the more it can feel holistic. And the one thing that I would ask educators to do is, when Carol Dweck was speaking in San Francisco a while ago, I saw her and she said that if she could say anything to families, she would love to say that when you're giving feedback, make it sincere and specific and process-based. And so I know we have a lot to communicate to families, but the more we can talk about using those kind of sincere modes of communication and feedback, the more that it will feel like a sense of agency and authentic learning for our students.
Can I just ask a quick question to Christine? So as you were talking about looping the families and about goals, for some reason, I went to behaviors of some of my kids, right? And, you know, and you're talking about sincere feedback. And so we have kids who are just really, really, really bright, and they're challenged by behaviors. You know, they're distractible. They have a hard time being engaged. And so what would you say about, like, to set goals about, you know, behavior? Because we're talking about mindset, right? Or like some of that self-control, and getting kids to say, wow, if I can exercise some self-control, look what I can achieve, as opposed to getting distracted. And so what's your take on, like, behavioral goals and looping the family in? Because the families are probably seeing some of that at home too. And I don't know, just what's your opinion?
Sure. So I always go back, and sometimes I have to repeat it as a mantra, that that kids do well if they can, right? The Ross Green line, like, kids do well if they can. And if they're not doing well academically, I need to think about, you know, adding some additional supports. And the same goes for behaviorally. And so Ross Green has a really good problem-solving protocol. He calls them lagging skills, as opposed to what I used to say, like behavioral challenges or, disruptive behavior. And so he calls them lagging skills. And he has a process where the teacher and the student and certainly the family could sit down and really think about what are the lagging skills, the social, emotional, developmental skills, and self-control is a piece of it. Certainly, that we could focus on work on, and what are, just like we do with more academic skills or transferable skills, what are the steps? What are some of the supports I'm going to need? What specifically am I going to work on? Because I think for a lot of students, their lives, and this is not true for all students, but their lives are at such a place where they're operating in a place where they just are trying to get their most basic needs met, and these lagging skills are like the next step. And then the next step beyond that are setting some really big academic skills. But we need to, as educators, be thinking about the whole student. And certainly if we're having a growth mindset about, their reading or their math or their transferable skills, then we can about their behavioral skills as well.
I really appreciate that, Christine. And having just spent the full day with a cohort of educators thinking about restorative practices and really changing their school culture, and it's all about the relationship piece and building community. But also, I would push back a little bit respectfully around that question around behavior goals and say, like, whose goal is that? Is that our goal as an educator because they're exhibiting X, Y, and Z in our classroom? Or is that really an authentic goal for that child? Or is there some skill or need that's not being met? And so I would push back and say, like, whose goal is that? And maybe do a little reflective work as the educator on why that might be the behavior that is, or the lagging skill because it might not be the lagging skill in all settings. And so we want to be really careful about that too, around like, why might this be what I observe in my classroom? And is this something that we're observing in all settings? And then if that's the case, how can we support this youth in gaining the skills they need? But I would first push back and say, whose goal is it? And
well, can I just follow up on that a little bit? I just think that's a huge conversation, and I'm finding that there's all these threads that we're weaving together. So Christine had mentioned this idea that all kids want to do well. And then there's also this idea, a friend of mine who's a teacher always says, behavior is a form of communication, right? So how are you reading that communication? And then the question is, well, how do you set an authentic goal? And you have to know the families, because the families can probably give you great insight. And you have to know the kid too. So there's the identity relationship piece. There's this idea of helping a kid be successful. And then, as Lindsay just mentioned, is the kid distracting my class? Is that a problem for me? Or is it a problem, because I haven't found a solution for that kid to let him or her be really effective? And I think this is a very interesting conversation to kind of weave those parts together so that you could set goals for some of those kids that were co-constructed, the teacher, the family, and the kid. So to help them feel like that they could do as well as they could, and to also allow them to be successful. I don't know. I just think that's a really interesting to hear all these threads kind of being woven together.
Yeah, fundamentally, sorry, just to tie it back together and like put back to what Christine stated in the beginning, that it's truly about the relationship and understanding, really having that time to sit and whether it's through the goal conferencing in a workshop model or just getting to understand the unique needs of each of the individual students, and then also their families, and that relationship piece is so essential.
I think that's what I was just going to add, Lens, was like, it's really easy sometimes, I think, too, to impose or to assume that the parents have the skill set to be able to give sincere and specific and process-based feedback. I think we used to have a parent council and have parent buddies, and we don't have that anymore because the culture isn't quite there. But I'm just mindful of the fact that we need to be educating our parents, I guess, as much, and really supporting them about how to do this work, because they don't have, they're not, they're not educators. They're not in this process with us. They get a tired kid that comes home at the end of the day, and coming up with ways to support parents, I think is equally helpful.
I just want to piggyback on that, Meg, because I think that's the value of the student-led conference, is creating those spaces for families, and then really model, like, it does provide time to model for families, like how we talk to their kids and the way that we maybe compliment their students, or, talk through a challenge with their kids. And we can kind of be that, it's that idea of that guide on the side, right? You can help facilitate those conversations and also create that space for kids to really air their needs as well. And so I think I always feel like that's a real gap when we get to the middle level, because I think, and this is going into a different conversation, but we'll sort of come back, but thinking about how can we help parents, gain skills to parent in a way. And this is coming from someone who's not a parent, but just observing middle level, there's so many fewer opportunities for middle level families to come together and talk about what it's like to be a parent, as opposed to in the younger grades. And so I just think that that's a part of it too, is creating those spaces for families to be together where we can help model some of those pieces.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I was just going to ask one final question before we get into our Q&A from the field. And I think I'm curious just about intentional conversations and opportunities to talk about growth mindset and self-talk. Positive self-talk.
Yeah.
And growth mindset. What are folks, what does that look like in the classroom? What are those intentional conversations and opportunities?
I would just say it's just providing as many opportunities as you can for reflection. I think one of the things that I'm always reminded about is that for so long I asked for reflection to be paper pencil reflection, like, sit down and type something, write this in your email or whatever. And using options like Flipgrid or just other ways to help kids stop and reflect, and to share, creating a culture. It goes back to that relationship piece, but creating a culture in your classroom where you can share what other kids' reflections are, so that a student who's struggling can see, like, oh, this is, well, she's struggling too, because that's what she just shared in her, in her reflective piece. Opens the door, I think, for feeling safe to acknowledge, this is what I'm good at. This is where I get stuck, because we all get stuck. And I think modeling, I just tell them all the time, I'm stuck on this, or here's my blind spot, or whatever it is. So
I think I agree with the different reflection pieces. I think that's really important. I think there's a wide range of protocols that we can be using in the classroom too. And I'm just thinking to myself about, we're talking about time-intensive exercises, and we're all being pushed to, get all this curriculum done at the same time. And it's such a rush. You have these transitions. And when I start listening to you folks talking about how important it is to slow down and to think about what we're, really consider what we're saying to kids and this positive self-talk. And so protocols is one way. And there's this guy named Jeff Swires who has a book called Academic Conversations, and a lot of sentence starters that you can use. And so, for example, peer editing, you can create sentence starters that kids use so that they're being positive, constructive criticism, and they're helping each other out, but in positive ways. And I don't have any self-talk sentence starters, but I think that showing kids that, hey, this is the way we communicate effectively. Lindsay just said, she used, I'm going to push back a little bit, which is a very nice way of saying, hey, let's talk about this point, and giving kids those sentence starters and those skills, I think is really critical, and making it in a structured way that they don't have to grasp at straws or they don't fall back on typical behaviors can be a really effective way. And then when you catch them using the sentence starters or that positive talk, you reinforce really positive behavior that can also help make your community a much more effective learning environment.
Great.
I always found I tried to be really intentional with my kids talking about the brain and how the brain learns. And so it wouldn't be necessarily an aside, but we would talk about, you know, a lot of times it would be when we were talking about picking a just right book and how that challenges your brain. And then, you know, talking about developing neural pathways and these different things. Because I think also one thing that we know about young adolescents is they really like to learn about themselves. And their brain is a part of who they are. And so once you sort of lay that foundation and you weave it in, and it answers the why, like, why are we doing this? Or, you know, why are we doing something this way? Or just sort of some of that purpose work. Once you do that, then pulling in the reflections and being thoughtful about asking questions like, when this week did you stumble or find a challenge? And what did you say to yourself in your mind to help you move forward? You know, like those are sort of some of the ways that we can have kids start to pay attention to those things and help to develop it over time. So those are some of the things that I would think about doing in my classroom.
Awesome. It looks like, Don, we have some questions from the field.
Oh, Don, you're on mute.
We do have some questions, and we've talked a little bit about some of these. So one question, for example, is I have a student who seems disengaged in goal setting. What do I do next when kids sort of are, you know, they're refusing or they're not engaged? And I think that's a little bit tied to this. How many goals are we asking students to set? And for what period are you asking them to set that goal? So are we setting a year-long goal? And so if folks could maybe just talk about that. We've touched on it a little bit, but this idea of we have a disengaged learner who doesn't want to set goals. What do you do to maybe change that or address that challenge in your classroom? Meg, do you want to start?
Sure. So I kind of go back to that example of the reading goal. Although I'm mindful of the fact that it's a sort of somewhat teacher imposed, but asking a student, if there's something that we can open the door for that student that would allow them to collect some data. I don't know what that might be, but if there's some way for them to collect some concrete data around that goal, that they might start to see their efficacy. And I think whether it's like, let's do it around reading, or let's do it around how many minutes you're doing this task, or maybe we could do it on, I don't know, how many times you, I'm drawing a blank, but I'm just trying to think if there was something small, it goes to that idea of like, can we collect something over a 2-week period of time where it's short, it's sweet. I can collect some data and see if that might get me to see, this process is, can be transferred to other areas of who I am as a student. And that might get them over the hump because it's small and measurable. It's tiny.
Meg, one thing, and Kevin had to leave a little bit early, but I think Kevin showed me the use of emojis for goals, which is kind of using visuals where you have a sad face, a neutral face, and a happy face.
Right.
And you can just use these simple check-ins with visuals where you have a kid select, how did you feel you did on this goal? And what we did last year, we actually had kids develop their own scale using their, they picked emojis. So there was a little bit of the agency with them creating the scale. Cool. And that can be a way to kind of engage kids really simply. Bang, here's how I feel, and I'm going to show that visually. And then, as you mentioned, you can collect data over time on that. And I also think that sometimes we have kids who have these goals who we may not value, but it's really important to them. Like I have these kids right now who are really into getting basketball shoes. You know, that's what they're thinking about. And, you know, how do you help them set a goal around that that's achievable? And that goes back to that transferable skill. But what are other folks, Lindsay or Maura and Christine, what do you recommend for this idea of disengagement? And, you know, do you change the number of goals for kids who seem disengaged in the process?
Yeah, I can, you know, I think from my experience, I would always go back to and say, have I created a safe space for this child? And so I would go back and say, maybe I need to do some relationship building with this student and really figure out like what makes them, what drives them? Like where is this child the happiest? What are those things that that child is doing? And so by slowing down and going back and trying to build that relationship. And it's one of the things that, you know, I can't remember who it was, but it was something about, you know, taking 5 minutes and having a conversation with a child where the child leads the conversation and you're just sort of a listener and asking some focused questions, but it could go anywhere and just sort of getting to know the student. And so I think that's sort of the first thing. So looking at that, and then of course differentiate. I'd rather have a kid who changed their goal every single week, but it's a goal that they selected than something that I thought was what they should be doing. Like, I really think that you learn as much from, you know, being successful in checking all the boxes as you do from stumbling a few times and getting there. You might even learn more in setting many, many, many goals. But then it's being that intentional about reflecting, I think, about, you know, what it is that you're experiencing. But I do also think that it's important to remember, and I think the emoji reflection thing brings it back, that, and Meg was talking about this too, when we're asking students to reflect, are we creating barriers for kids that we're not intending? So are we asking them to constantly rely on written expression? You know, goal setting, to me, it's really a place that this is where we should be differentiating a lot for our students.
And I would just add also that, sorry, Christine.
Go for it.
I'll try to be quick. I saw we both jumped in at the same time. That first of all, I would have to ask myself, like, what have I done to support this idea of goal setting in my community? And like, what are the stories that we've shared around goal setting and why people set goals? And we, you know, and then of course, as Maura just said, like, what it boils down to the relationship, you know, and that, you know, that when you feel like you're valued in a community, then it makes sense for you to, you know, be vulnerable and set goals. We all have things that we need to work on. And so first of all, like, why are we setting goals, sharing that piece with kids? Because I think now in the age of Act 77 and personalized learning plans and the goal setting piece, there's many people that feel we're doing it just to check off the boxes. And so if we're not explicit on why we set goals throughout our life all the time, small, medium, and large goals, and we don't share stories of people who have set goals and what that experience is like, then there's no frame of reference. So sharing, you know, first of all, setting the foundation about why, and then making the connections and ongoing relationship, and having that time to sit down and talk about, as Dawn said, and I think Maura said this too, about like, what are their interests? What are they already interested in that they're working on? So like, we might have our own ideas of goals, but that's not for us that's not our place, you know? So goals are personal, and they should come from a place where people want to pursue these goals. And there's always those conversations. And once they see success in reaching a goal or moving towards, you know, mastery, as Christine said, then I feel like we get much more buy-in.
Christine?
Yeah, I was just going to add that chances are, if a student is feeling disengaged in the goal-setting process, they feel kind of disengaged in other aspects of what's happening in the classroom too. And so just being reflective as teachers without taking it super personally, which is hard, of how your students can see themselves heard and seen and reflected in the classroom. Sarah Ahmed just wrote a book called Being the Change, and it's for middle level classrooms and high school classrooms. And it's a really great book about helping students express and develop their own self-identity, and also navigate the social complexities of social comprehension and being a person in the world today. So if that's just one resource that I wanted to share about making sure that your curriculum, your plans as a teacher, make your students feel like they're reflected and they can express themselves. And that looks like a very complicated process. That's maybe a topic for another day too.
Well, and I think it's important too that that the curriculum reflects maybe some of those kids as well, like the reading choices that you're making and some of the things that you are bringing into the classroom, so that those kids feel like you are talking to them and addressing them. We have about 4 minutes left, and I just, first of all, I want to really thank Christine for coming on. It's really great, and I also want to mention that we are going to have a follow-up document that will have Christine's, maybe can share some of her resources, and for example, that book by Ahmed, Being the Change, we can list that too. And then we're going to bring it to a close here with just some of the important events that are happening around Vermont, and then I'll ask people to chime in about some other things. On October 23rd, the Rowland Foundation is having their annual conference with keynote speaker Dr. Ruha Benjamin. There's also on November 1st and November 2nd, Paul Gorski is presenting on the equity literacy approach and becoming a threat to inequity in classrooms and schools. I'm going to let Lindsay talk about mastermind mentors. Correct? Is that a
yeah, that's so, and we can put on the resource page who to contact, but Up for Learning is offering an opportunity for upper elementary, high school youth that are interested in working with younger learners in a mentoring role around these ideas of growth mindset and self-talk. So there will be a day on October 24th where these middle high school youth come together with an adult partner to learn about some of the tools for mentoring, and then talk about how to establish a mentoring relationship with younger students in grades K through 3. And Bruce Perlow, one of my colleagues, is gearing that up, and I can add his email address to that resource list so that people can get in touch with him.
Yeah, and maybe because that's next week, maybe we could tweet that out too. Mm-hmm. That would be good. And then there's also November 15th and 16th, there's a Youth Climate Leadership Academy at the Hulbert Outdoor Center in Fairleigh. That's geared, I think that's geared more towards high school kids or high school youth and adult teams. And then there's also on November 15th, the Voices for Vermont's Children annual conference. Does anybody have anything they'd like to add, or any resources that they think would be valuable to educators out there?
Next week I forgot to put it on here, but next week on Wednesday, there's the Personalized Learning and Flexible Pathways Showcase. So there's some schools around the state, high schools primarily, who've been looking at developing opportunities within their schools, and they're going to be having a showcase of the programs that they've developed over the past year.
Sorry, where is that again?
It's on Wednesday, and it's at Lake Maury.
Okay.
And it was in the field memo 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
You can find it there.
Anybody else have any resources or events happening? Okay. Our next webinar, the PLP Pathways webinar, is happening on Thursday, November 15th. We'll be talking about student-led conferences and family engagement. We'll be able to tie into this conversation as well. For viewers out there, don't forget, there is, and I'll post this on Twitter again, you can get a professional development hour from the Middle Grades Collaborative and PLP Pathways for watching our program. Again, I'd like to thank Christine Hertz for joining us tonight, and I'm going to let Maura close us out. Thanks, Maura, for all your hard work.
Yeah, thanks. So I hope everyone has a nice evening, and we'll see you on the 15th.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Bye.